Hey all, today we're going to discuss Azure Landing Zone Sandbox design. So this video is on behalf of Festive Tech Calendar 2023. So the Festive Tech Calendar is a yearly event by the community for the community, and the charity of choice this year is the Raspberry Pi Foundation. So the Raspberry Pi Foundation is a global nonprofit with a mission to help young people learn how to code, create, and solve meaningful problems using technology. They believe that every young person, whatever their background and wherever they are in the world, deserves the opportunity to learn digital skills and gain confidence to create digital technologies. So I'll put the link down below for like a give a little page if you want to donate or spread the word about the Raspberry Pi Foundation. It'll be appreciated. So who am I? My name is Luke Murray. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a senior consultant from Hamilton, New Zealand. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP, and I also run a Microsoft learning room called Azure Cloud Commanders. So today we'll be discussing Azure Landing Zones, which is a fundamental approach to setting up an environment for successful Azure cloud deployments. Let's delve into how we can design sandbox environments effectively. First, why should you care? So, Gartner have just recently released their top 10 strategic technology trends of 2024. So, AI as a partner, be safe with continuous threat management exposure, protect the future with sustainable technology, and four, which we'll be talking about a bit today, is developer driven self service platform engineering. So, what is platform engineering and what is self-service functionality when we consider Azure? Let's dig into that a bit more. So platform engineering is the discipline of building and operating self-service internal platforms. Each platform is a layer created and maintained by a dedicated product team designed to support the needs of its users by interfacing with tools and processes. What does that mean? So let's look at this a bit more with a diagram. So this diagram is also from Gartner, but it's product and service teams. You've got almost the platform as a service by a developer portal, so that's managed by the platform teams. And then you as a consumer or a developer then consumes the reusable components, the tools, the platform services, and the portal, self-service portal experience maintained by the platform teams. And then the DevOps teams then really use the services that are provided for them. So platform engineering helps optimize developer experience and accelerates the delivery. It reduces cognitive load through improvement of the developer experience and productivity. So the platform engineering team are constantly improving the experience of the developer. And you don't really need to worry so much about the underlying infrastructure and whether it meets security concerns because that's all managed by the platform engineering team. So it's really about the developer's ability to independently run, manage, and develop their applications while ensuring their solutions are reliable and secure. And you're also maintaining T talent retention as well, because you really, instead of the developers having to focus on the infrastructure and networking components, that's all maintained by the platform engineering team. And it's really, to me, it's platform as a service, but you meaning the actual like Azure platform. So when it comes to Azure, how can Microsoft Azure help with this? So we're going to discuss a brief overview of Azure landing zones and how that can relate, what components you need to think of when it comes to sandbox environments. So depending on what you're building, so whether it's a house, a stadium, or a ship capable of interstellar travel, really depends on what you need to build that. So not all foundations are treated equally. So if you're building a house, it's going to have a different foundation to a stadium or a ship. When it comes to Azure Landing Zone, there are definitely different areas to consider that is part of the well-architected and cloud adoption frameworks. Things like identity, who can access it, when can they access it, resource organization, how do you organize your subscriptions, your resource group, your resources? What about business continuity and disaster recovery? What are your apps or services that need to be redundant or don't need to be redundant? What about the 3 availability zones that run in a single region? Your operations baseline, who's going to support it? Are they meeting key SLA and SLO internal organization directives? How do you deploy it? Is it infrastructure as code? Is it ClickOps? Is it GitOps? How do you manage that? And the governance disciplines like naming resources, making sure that people are reviewing supports or Azure policy compliance reports. How do you connect to that with network topology and connectivity and enterprise enrollment? How do you create new subscriptions? Who has access to that overarching billing and enrollment to create resources and how that's done? So all these things need to be really considered when you're designing Azure landing zones. An example is, as you see, so this is the enterprise scale reference architecture. So this is a foundational view of what Microsoft could recommend enterprise Azure landing zone would look like. So you've got your Active Directory infrastructure, which holds your identities on-prem, and then they're synced up to Azure Active Directory or Entra ID, as it is now called, through AD Sync or AD Cloud Connect. And then once your credentials are in Azure Active Directory or Entra ID, they can be used to then access your cloud resources. And they don't need to be synced using on-premise IDs. They could be cloud-only users as well. So within Azure, you've got something called management groups. So you've got a tenant group, which is created by default when you create your first management group. And then underneath that is different management groups and layers that you can build. So in this example, we've got Contoso. So that's organization name. And then under the organization, you've got things like the Sandbox, the decommissioned landing zones. So really that's your application, dev test, production landing zones, and platform. So the platform is really about the Azure platform. So the connectivity, this is where your things like your network connectivity or your virtual WAN or hub and spoke will go into. The management is things like automation account and log analytics workspaces that you may have. And then your identity subscription and management group would have things like your Azure Key Vault or your domain controllers that you may need that are shared across multiple landing zones and multiple applications or services that you might be consuming. And so how the management group and the subscription layers really are designed comes down to organization preference. But what you can see here is the Sandbox subscription is off to the side. So it's within its own subscriptions are off to its own, under its own management group. So they're really off to the side. They're not part of the landing zones. And that means that you can be a bit more flexible with the type of Azure policies in your RBAC models. So you don't have people that have access to the wrong things. You're not constantly having to exclude policies from getting delivered because your policies that prevent things like public IP addresses and things like that may be on the landing zones management group, but they're not at your Sandbox layer. So it means that you don't have to go in and constantly add exclusions for your Sandbox environment, but we'll get to some of those anti-patterns and trade-offs shortly. So let's take a look when it comes to the context of the Sandbox. So when you're designing a Sandbox environment in Azure, the Sandbox is really ideal for accelerating your projects. And after you deploy your Sandbox environment, you can add services and capabilities for things like self-learning, hackathons, testing, and development. It's really about an environment to learn. This is not a dev test environment I'm talking about. It's just an environment for people to go into and learn new tools, functionalities that may not be quite ready for production yet, but you want to keep on board. You want to accelerate that learning growth. And when it comes to platform engineering, it does really sit in the developer portal, the reusable components, the tools, the platform services. This is a key component, keeping your business accelerating and your users happy because they get to experience and learn with Azure products as they grow. So as we kind of discussed about, the sandbox is off to the side and it's usually isolated with data. So what I mean by that is usually there's an agreement where you may not store production data into your sandbox, so it's isolated. This is mainly because with the sandbox environment, the idea is to not have as much governance or policy restrictions when it comes to being able to learn. You don't want the same restrictions that, such as no public IP addresses or the different regions that you're deploying to in your sandbox. You want a lot more freedom. Things like Azure OpenAI, you may want to restrict that more in a production environment than you do in your sandbox environment. So, but in order to do that, you may need terms of service or agreements with your sandbox consumers that they're not going to be storing production or client data in there. It's usually segregated from your network. So an example is you don't want someone in your sandbox environment to connect or peer a virtual network that they've just created to your production environment and then have on-prem access. Identity and access controls can be a bit different, but you still need to consider compliance and regulatory considerations when it comes to your sandbox. But it's really about off to the side, this is an environment for learning. This is not an environment for dev test. And you really need to consider things like, does it actually need network connectivity to on-prem, or are you happy with accessing these resources over the internet as long as guardrails are in place? So let's touch a bit on the anti-patterns. So I kind of alluded to it earlier, but when it comes to sandbox anti-patterns, they're really about patterns to avoid, mainly because they'll get in the way of what the true intentions of the sandbox are. And that's to allow people to experience, or as I say, click, click, oops. They want to be able to just go click, click, oops, muck something up. I didn't fully understand it in a safe way, in a safe environment. So some of the things to be aware of is policies to restrict locations. So what I mean by this is you want to be able to avoid policies that are restricting where certain regions resources can be placed into. A really good example is Azure OpenAI. So I'm in New Zealand and my closest Azure region at the moment is Australia East. Azure OpenAI wasn't available in Australia East when the models first came out because they didn't have enough GPU capacity. They were only in strategic regions like the West US. If I had policies in place that prevented me from being able to restrict where resources were created, so an example is only in Australia East, I wouldn't have been able to play with Azure OpenAI until months down the track. So this can really be a huge barrier to learning, especially when you're looking at strategic Azure services. Overextensive block lists is another one that to be avoided. Again, you don't really know what services people want to play with or avoid. So make sure you don't make sure that blocking is an exception, not a rule when it comes to blocking different resource types, and just trying to build the entire platform as once. Hopefully this video gives you a guideline on really the things to avoid and the things to think about, but just build your use case bit by bit by bit. Perfection is definitely not the definition of done. It's something that you need to iterate on as your consumers and people start using the sandbox. You'll start building out that capability and the requirements. So when it comes to the different types of sandboxes you may be looking at, I like to think of it as 4 different sort of sandbox types. You've got your personal, You've got your unmanaged, your lightly managed, and your managed. So I'll discuss what each of these are shortly. But before I go to the next slide, I just want to discuss personal a bit because this is the only place that we'll really talk about it. When I'm talking about a personal sandbox, I'm thinking about your MSDN or your Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. I'm talking about your pay-as-you-go credit card that you might have just stood up to test. I'm talking about your Azure free trial account where that's personal to you. You've created it, set up your subscription, set up your Azure resources, and that's all you need. That's really a personal sandbox. It's not based on your organization. It's really based on you. It's based on the Visual Studio Enterprise credit that you may have. That's really what I refer to as a sandbox type. But let's go into what unmanaged, lightly managed, and managed actually means. So what I mean by this is depending on your requirements and depending on how your sandbox is being used really depends on what type of environment and what controls and policies that you might have in place. An example is unmanaged sandbox. So this is really predefined subscription. So this is an Azure subscription that you're giving to your sandbox owner and consumers, and they can do what they want within that subscription. So they can create resource groups, they can delete them, they can create multiple different types of resources, all within the context of that subscription. So that's really subscription as a service, or giving them access to one or more subscriptions and allowing them the flexibility to do what they want within that. And it's usually medium to small, medium, large teams operate in a subscription-based model. The next one is lightly managed sandbox. So they're resource groups. So this is where you might have a small team where instead of having dozens of subscriptions, you may have one or two subscriptions. And then it's really about giving resource group. And then the sandbox consumers can then create what they want within the context of that resource group or resource groups. So they don't have access to the subscription, but they have access to create and manage resources within a resource group. It's really about the small teams or individuals that you might consider that. So instead of giving them an entire subscription, you're better off going, you may pay for or take accountability of this resource group. And the third one here is highly managed sandbox. And what I mean by this is that they're pre-constrained self-service environments. You may have developer teams that all they do is deploy Azure Kubernetes Service, a bunch of function apps in a web app. And that's all they do every single time they're developing applications. So in order to do that, and they don't care about the underlying Azure infrastructure, they deploy their web app, they get their endpoint, so the URL, they get their FTP credentials that they need to connect to it. That's all they need. And then they might delete that and then recreate it again. So this is about just giving them a really highly managed resource group where all the services like their Azure Kubernetes service or their function or their web app are deployed for them automatically. And then they click a button and that goes away. So depending on what type of environment, whether it's unmanaged, lightly managed, or managed, really depends on the flexibility and how much management there is for the platform engineering team. An example is unmanaged. So it's definitely more aimed at the developers or sandbox consumers to really fully customize their environment because they essentially have free reign over the subscription. And there's less management for the platform engineering team to do. We're lightly managed, which is just resource group scope, sandbox types, is a bit more constrained. So people can't deploy across resource groups. People may have issues with access to some things because of RBAC and things like that, because they're just really constrained to that one resource group. And that requires, it's less customizable and it requires a bit more administration by the platform engineering team to manage because they have to create the resource groups. They have to create the intra ID groups and permissions to allow everyone to connect to their own specific resource groups. And then the third one is managed, where it's really managed by the platform engineering teams, and then the sandbox or the developers just really consume that. So keep in mind when you're looking at the different types of sandboxes, really how much administration is involved, what the requirements are, and what you really want the outcome on. For me personally, I know a lot of the clients that I talk to about this really sit in unmanaged and lightly managed because it's all about they want the flexibility, they're working as a team, and they want to try different stuff and link them together, like Azure OpenAI plus API management. They may have multiple people working on it, potentially people from other organizations as well, and unmanaged may sit. But we'll talk about personas very shortly. So just to recap on the sandbox type, the main difference is that managed sandboxes have predetermined services that can be deployed as needed. Lightly managed are when you have a lot of individuals wanting specific regulated resource groups that they stand up the resources into. And then in contrast, the unmanaged sandbox is more open and less restrictive. It's for learning and trying new technologies for a small to large team. So when you're considering whether you're looking at a lightly managed, unmanaged, or highly managed sandboxes, there are different decisions that you really need to consider the purpose. So what exactly is the sandbox for? The security of it. Who has access to it? Who will need access to it in the future? The scope, the life cycle, as in how long is that sandbox going to be around for? Is it going to be a permanent sandbox for the duration of that team's existence? Or is it only going to exist for 3 months because someone wants to to learn for a short amount of time? Maybe they're studying for an exam. How are you going to monitor that? Does the sandbox need any integration with anything else? Whether it's internal or third party services, the cost. How are you going to manage the cost of this? Who's accountable for it? Who's responsible for it? The access, the management, the governance. Another thing to consider is also around migration. Keep in mind the sandbox is environment for learning. It's not an environment for dev test. But if you've got something that someone has been building or playing around with and they want to take that into dev test or production, how do they do that? What does that look like? So let's take a scenario and let's take a look at Azure OpenAI and how that may align to a sandbox environment in Azure. So to do that, we'll have a look at a persona called Samuel. So Samuel's a data scientist and he works for a large team that wants to deliver high quality and robust machine learning solutions to their clients. So Samuel really wants an environment that he can play with. He can learn the latest and most advanced techniques and methods. He can collaborate and learn from other data scientists and experts in the field, both internally in his organization and externally. Samuel's also accountable for the cost and the management to the environment. So he's taking ownership to really own the cost of that environment, and he's accountable for anything that gets deployed in it. He's really the sandbox owner. So let's take a look at what that might look like. First, we'll have a look at the AI shared responsibility model. So this is a model by Microsoft on really what's supported. So SaaS as in Copilot, the majority of the Copilot resources are supported by Microsoft, which includes the application, most of the application layer and all of the AI platform. When you look at PaaS, so Azure AI, you're really looking at the AI application and it's really dependent on the type of model that you're consuming. Depends on how much Microsoft really manages for you and how much you do as the consumer. But in this example, Samuel wants to play with Azure OpenAI. He's really looking at the AI application landscape. So it's the AI plugins, the data connections. He's looking at the application design and implementation and the infrastructure. And so when we start to really go back to some of these requirements, we go, right, that makes sense. That's on us. We need to then supply him an environment to do that. We don't need to really worry as much about some of the AI platform underneath because that's managed by Microsoft. So once we've talked to Samuel, we've understood his requirements here we've understood his purpose, we've understood his life cycle, we've understood how he's going to manage it and govern the cost and the access to the environment. Based on the conversations with him, we've come to the conclusion that for Samuel's use case, because he wants to learn new skills, he wants to evaluate cutting edge technology, and more important, one of the factors is he works with external team members, internally and externally. So multiple people that may be doing the same thing as him or definitely isolated from production. And he's mainly the main thing is really working around the roles, the racy model, right? Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed is a key part to successful sandbox environment creation and ownership. So he's accepted accountability of the costs and access for his team members who will then be responsible for delivering and creating the stuff alongside Samuel. So when we had a discussion with Samuel, we've had a look at the discussion of the AI shared responsibility. We've decided that the right sandbox type for Samuel is unmanaged. So what could that look like? So in this example here, we have a sandbox environment. So we've got the sandbox management group up the top, and that's managed by the platform team. So the sandbox management group has a couple of policies in it. So that might be things like enabling Defender for Cloud, tagging the subscriptions underneath it. Really key policies that very lightly at a sandbox management layer, control the rest of it underneath. It could be things like deploying, things like auto shutdown of virtual machines, things like that. And that's managed by the platform team. And then underneath that is a management group that's called the data teams. That's Samuel's team. And that's starting to get where the data team or Samuel's team starts to really own. So as you can see in the diagram, the top part of the Enter ID, the sandbox management groups, the sandbox subscriptions, management subscription, which is all about things like automation. You may have that across multiple different sandboxes. That's owned by the platform team, where anything underneath the data team management group, which may include one or more subscriptions, is managed by the data team. Because it's unmanaged, the data team with Samuel can really deploy what they need to within that subscription or subscriptions underneath that data team management group. So things like they could deploy Azure OpenAI services in one resource group. They could deploy API management or application gateway in another. In this example, Samuel and his team have been playing around with RAG, so retrieval augmented generation patterns, on top of Azure OpenAI. So they've got their data in their storage account. They've got their Azure AI search service, or previously known as cognitive search, in another resource group. And they can really play around and implement the solutions and the resources that they can in that subscription. They can also deploy into that subscription using Azure DevOps, GitHub, and infrastructure as code if they want to, because they have the access to the entire subscription. They can do that deployment through that if they want to, or they can click. It's really up to them on how they do it, as long as they adhere to the platform engineering standards when it comes to sandbox and data types, and the type of data that's in those environments, but that's really enforced by the policy up the top. And then, yeah, the data team really can manage usually as contributor into that subscription. So it really gives them the flexibility. And then we've got the highly managed resource group. So highly managed is really about the resource group level. So your predefined applications and services that are managed by the platform team. But for Samuel's use case and the data team, they really just have access to anything under the data team. But hopefully this gives you a bit more context on what your environment could look like when you're dealing with a sandbox environment. So keep in mind, I've been discussing a sandbox as a pathway to learning, not a pathway to production. But off to the side, we know what reality is. People will create stuff in their sandbox. An example is Samuel might really love the successful deployment they've done playing around with Azure OpenAI services. And now they want to take that to production. What are the things that they might want to think about when doing this? Keep in mind that the sandbox doesn't have any connectivity to on-premises, and it shouldn't, and that will remain the same. The sandbox is for learning. It's not a dev test environment. But if they do want to consider taking what they've learned and looking at that in the dev test environment, what are the things to consider? It's really about identifying and documenting their requirements and the specifications of what they've learned. So they've been learning a lot in the sandbox environment. What have they learned? What are their actual requirements for going to production? What are their security considerations? For example, every organization will have different requirements when it comes to security, but what about the RBAC access? Do they need review of CISO? When you're looking at moving things to production, make sure that the data code models and the outputs that they've been playing around with in the sandbox environment are really suitable for a production or a dev test environment. Again, if they've been deploying stuff to their sandbox environment using CI/CD, so continuous integration, continuous deployment, then they can really easily take that and move it to another environment like dev test and production with a few changes. How they deploy is also a consideration in that. Make sure they test and debug their service as well. A lot of the times when you move from a learning environment into a dev test or production environment, the dev test and production environment will be more controlled, more restrictive. So you might find that in the sandbox learning environment, stuff will just work. But in a production and dev test environment, you have firewalls or network security group controls, additional controls and risk factors that you may need to consider and run into. So make sure you test and you make sure that any issues you encounter aren't due to any configuration. And finally, just monitor and manage your environment. One of the things when you're looking into how you architect a dev test environment is a bit different to how you consider a sandbox environment. So just remember, a sandbox environment is just off to the side. It's isolated. Ideally, it's not linked to your production network unless really required. You have extra controls to it. But when you're looking at a dev test environment, Microsoft recommends something called a canary environment. So in this example, you've got your Contoso organization and then the landing zones and the platform off to the side underneath the tenant group management group. And then you've got your canary environment off to the side of Contoso. So that's sitting at the same level of management group, but has a prefix of canary to it. But it looks exactly the same. This allows you to test things like your policies. This allows you to test things like your connectivity, potentially, your management. So what type of scripts or automation and reporting that you might have in production. You can test it off to the side in Canary. It's depending on the type of environment it's definitely something to consider because it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of your testing. And I'll get more onto why the canary model here kind of makes a bit more sense. Again, these are just with the cloud adoption framework and the well architected framework by Microsoft. There are frameworks. You really need to take what your organization requirements are and make sure that whatever you do works for you, but can scale. So when designing and looking at how you architect an Azure environment, make sure you consider the strategic outcome of what the organization is. They may not need it now, but are they looking at adding other regions down the track? Are they looking at expanding their cloud services? Make sure you consider the future initiatives when you're considering a design as well, or you may end up like something like this. And this is what I see a lot of really small, medium organizations deploy, and this works for them, but there are some caution when you start to look at putting, instead of the canary model, putting prod, test, dev management groups underneath a corp or application landing zone. It doesn't really scale well. And it can be even worse when you start adding apps and apps on side of it. It can be really confusing on what's the difference between the environments. And in practice, what we found is the when you start looking at things like role-based access control and Azure policies that are flowing from top down, you usually end up with people having access to resources that they may not need. So not only do they have access to dev, but they might have access to production resources. Your Azure policies will end up with a whole bunch of exclusions because you may be deploying something to production, but you may not be deploying something to dev. And it can get really messy to try and avoid this if possible. But again, these are just recommendations. Make sure they work for you. For a small, medium business, this may, with an environment that may not change as much, this might be perfectly fine. So just take these recommendations with a grain of salt, but consider sort of the outcome that you're looking for as well. So to finish it off, we'll look at a few different tools, particularly related to the sandbox types that you may want to consider. So when we're looking at the highly managed sandbox, so remember, these are predefined resource groups that have application or services like Azure Community Service, a web app, a function app that get deployed all the time and then consumed, tore down, and recreated as needed by one or multiple sandbox consumers. You could look at something called Azure Deployment Environments. So Azure Deployment Environments allows you to set up template catalogs with infrastructure as code, such as Bicep, and Terraform is on the roadmap, around how you deploy your resources with inbuilt security. You want to make sure that resources you deploy are consistent every single time. And then deployment environments will give you a nice little UI, so a web interface that you give developers access to. They can go into the developer portal or the Azure deployment environment. Again, remember platform engineering and self-service capability. This is a key initiative here. So they go into the web UI, they click, I want to get that application. They click create. That then creates the application. It does or doesn't give them access to the underlying resource group. It's really configurable by you. Then once they're done, and then it spits out the URL of their web app as an example, then they click on that with some additional information, and then they can start to work with those products. And then when they're done, they go back to the user interface again. They click delete, shutdown. That then deletes all their Azure resources and the resource group, meaning that next time they start, they can go straight back. So when you're looking at highly managed sandbox and predefined environments, Azure deployment environments as you go to. When we consider lightly managed resource sandboxes, so keep in mind lightly managed sandboxes are just resource group level things. So you can create resources, but within a specific resource group. You may want to consider something like Azure Dev Test Labs. So Azure Dev Test Labs is very similar to Azure deployment environments, but it's mainly skewed at things like virtual machines. Using Azure Dev Test Labs, you can create predefined resources such as domain controllers to really get going within the context of your resource group. So it's really useful for student training, things like that. Just consider it's definitely a consideration when you're looking at lightly managed sandboxes and predefined environments within the context of that one sandbox. And finally, consider how you give access to your sandbox environment. Something that you can look into is Azure Entra ID access packages. So it requires a Microsoft Entra ID governance license, but allows you to set up an access package where, as a sandbox owner and if we go back to our example earlier about Samuel, the data scientist who had access and who was accountable for the cost of his unmanaged sandbox environment, Samuel would be the owner of an access package and his team would be the recipients. So his team would go in and submit a request to get access to the sandbox. They would enter justification why they want access to the sandbox. Samuel will then approve access to the sandbox. That will add Samuel's team members to the Entra ID groups that give them contributor access to the sandbox. And then Samuel can easily, using the Entra ID access package entitlement functionality, he can do things like access reviews. So every 6 months, he might go through the list or get an email saying, yep, that person still need access to the sandbox, or no, and no, he doesn't. And then that will remove that him or her from the group and then won't have access to the sandboxes anymore. And as part of this functionality, you can also do reviews. Which is especially useful when you may have a group of more than 100 or so users, where Entra ID will automatically do an access review where it will send you, as a sandbox consumer, an email. You can go, yes, I still need access to the sandbox. That would extend you access to the sandbox for another 6 months or predefined period that you can adjust. Or no, I no longer have access to that sandbox, and that will automatically remove you from the group, which may give you access to the sandbox, but it may also give you other things like access to a sandbox team site or a SharePoint page. Entra ID access packages can be key to enabling your sandbox users. Another thing to think about is really the data that's going into your sandbox environment, especially because you want unclassified data that doesn't contain things like your client information or company data. So you may have a terms of service that your users have agreed to, but how do you really know that they're compliant with that policy? And something to consider is Microsoft Purview for Azure. So it's really allowing you to do information protection across your environment, things that might be stored in your Azure storage account, things that might be stored in Synapse or SQL. Make sure that sensitive information is captured and alerted on. So consider, when you're looking at data governance in your Azure Sandbox environment, definitely consider Microsoft Purview. So there are a couple of recommended reading that I recommend you go into for further information. One is the Gartner Top 10 Strategic Technology Trends. The other is the Azure Sandbox, Azure Architecture Center Reference, the Cloud Adoption Framework, really the Azure Service Subscription Limits, Quotas, and Constraints. So this document is really key to how you architect your sandbox environment, especially if you're looking at things like lightly and highly managed, which again is the resource group scoped one, because you may be bound by some of the constraints when it comes to your Azure Service subscriptions and quotas. Just be aware of this. Of course, Azure deployment environments and Entra ID access packages we've just talked about. I'll put the links for these services in the description of this video. But I want to complete this video by saying thank you. Hopefully, you've learned something about the different types of sandboxes to consider, the different ways you may have architected it or thought about architected it. Fe- Feel free to reach out to me on social media. And if you have any questions, comments, or anything you want to know more about, definitely let me know.